The story of Pullman does not begin with fire, rebellion, or blood in the streets. It begins with a promise so beautiful, so polished, so perfectly wrapped in the language of progress, that thousands of men believed it without question. They arrived in the model town of Pullman with hope stitched into their pockets, their hearts full of dreams they'd never dared to speak aloud. A town built by the famous industrialist George Pullman, a place advertised as paradise, where workers would live clean, safe, respectable lives, far away from the filth and chaos of Chicago. The houses were painted the same soft colors, the streets lined with manicured grass, the brick buildings neat as if drawn with a ruler. The company owned every wall, every roof, every light post, but to the workers, that didn't matter. They believed they had found something close to a new beginning. For a while it even looked true. Wages were steady, rent was manageable, children played under the watchful eyes of a town built like a dream. But dreams, when controlled by one man, always become nightmares. When the economy collapsed in 1893, Pullman's factories slowed, and then they choked. George Pullman, the man hailed as a genius of order and efficiency, cut wages by nearly a third. Overnight, families who had just begun to breathe freely felt the invisible hands of hunger tightening around their throats. Yet the rents in the houses owned by the same man who cut their pay, did not fall. Workers were now being paid pennies, but the company demanded dollars. It didn't take long for hope to crumble. The same streets that once looked peaceful now looked suffocating, as if the buildings themselves were watching the workers struggle, whispering reminders that everything they had belonged to Pullman. Not one brick was truly theirs. It was not only money that broke them, it was dignity. It was the humiliation of watching their wives pawn wedding rings to buy bread. It was the sound of a hungry child asking why their father's company home was so cold. It was the sting of knowing that even if they died, George Pullman would charge their family rent for the day their body was carried out of the house. Silence became poison. Men who once laughed on their porches now sat stiffly, staring at the dust rising from the factory yard. The barber shop whispered. The tavern whispered louder. Rumors grew, stories of foremen mocking starving workers, of Pullman refusing to negotiate, of inspectors snooping like spies around every corner. It felt as if the town was shrinking around them, tightening like a noose. Then came the moment when something inside them finally cracked. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it was the quiet decision to refuse one more humiliation. A small group of workers walked off their shifts, calling out the truth that everyone already felt burning in their bones. Within hours, the walkout became a strike, and within days, the strike grew into a storm so large it shook the entire country. Men who had never raised their voices now raised their fists. The name Pullman no longer meant safety. It meant betrayal. It meant control. It meant every sleepless night and every empty plate. The rebellion lit up like a spark touching gasoline. Rail lines halted. Thousands joined. The federal government trembled at the idea of workers uniting across states, and George Pullman watched from behind the glass windows of his mansion, refusing to bend, refusing to admit that his perfect town had become a cage. The strike was no longer about money. It became a battle for dignity, for the right to be human, for the right to breathe without asking permission from the man who owned the ground beneath their feet. These were not trained fighters. They were ordinary workers pushed into extraordinary fury. And as the smoke of rebellion began to rise, the world finally learned the truth. No matter how beautiful a town appears, no matter how polished its walls, if freedom is missing, the entire place becomes a prison, and sooner or later, prisoners revolt. They called it a miracle town when it first rose from the empty, windswept prairie south of Chicago, rows of tidy brick homes, blooming gardens, paved streets, a glittering hotel, a grand arcade, and a clock tower that chimed like it belonged to another world. Pullman, Illinois looked nothing like the soot-stained industrial hellscape spreading across America in the late 1800s. It was clean, quiet, landscaped, and arranged with mathematical precision. Visitors walked through its perfect streets believing they had stepped into the future. But the workers who lived inside this engineered paradise slowly learned that every brick was placed with a purpose. And every purpose led back to one man, George Mortimer Pullman. Pullman, the brilliant but tyrannical industrialist, wanted more than a company town. He wanted a living advertisement for his empire, a model of order, discipline, and productivity. He believed workers performed better when surrounded by beauty, so he designed the town like a painting, manicured lawns, fresh paint, flowers lining every walkway. But beneath the polished surface lay an invisible machinery of control that touched every part of life. Front porches had rules, window curtains had rules, even the grass had rules. A single overgrown hedge could trigger a warning letter from the company. A dirty front step could bring a fine. And if anyone stepped too far out of line, Pullman's managers issued expulsions without appeal. The illusion of paradise demanded absolute obedience. Life inside Pullman felt like living under a microscope. Every house was owned by the company. Every shop, every school, every church, every bar of soap sold at the company store was Pullman approved. Workers paid rent directly back to the same corporation that paid their wages, creating a cycle where money entered one pocket only to return to the other. Families lived with the constant knowledge that one angry foreman, one bad week in the factory, or one whispered accusation of rebellion could mean eviction by nightfall. In Pullman's eyes, the town was a carefully tuned instrument. In the eyes of the workers, it slowly became a velvet prison. At first, some workers were charmed. Their previous neighborhoods had been overcrowded slums with muddy streets and sewage in the alleys. In Pullman, they had gardens, fresh water, and a sense of safety unknown in industrial America. For a moment, it truly looked like a worker's utopia. But that moment faded quickly. It began with small things. Curfews enforced without discussion. Inspectors entering homes uninvited to ensure cleanliness. Foremen lecturing children in the streets for running too loudly. Soon, families realized they did not live in a town but in a demonstration project designed to impress outsiders more than to protect the residents inside. Pullman's control stretched even further than behavior. It reached into hearts, ambitions, and dreams. Men who hoped to start small businesses discovered that Pullman forbade independent shops. Women who tried to open sewing rooms or bakeries received polite notices that such enterprises were not compatible with town policy. No one could buy their home, no one could plant what they wished, no one could paint their own door without company approval. Even church sermons were monitored for dangerous ideas. Peace was mandatory, contentment was required, silence was expected. The deeper workers lived within Pullman's grand experiment, the more they realized that the beauty around them was not a gift. It was a tool. The town's charm existed to soften resistance, to convince workers they owed their loyalty, gratitude, and silence to the man who built their environment. It existed to remind them, every time they walked the neat streets, that Pullman could take it all away. Wealthy visitors toured the town, marveling at the happy workers and harmonious design, unaware that the workers presenting these polite smiles were doing so under the watch of company agents who took note of every conversation. Inside the homes behind closed doors, the truth was different. Families whispered late at night, sharing their fears in low voices so that passing inspectors would not overhear. Some spoke of how the beautiful brick houses trapped sound in strange ways, making it feel like the walls themselves were listening. A worker once joked that Pullman could hear his heartbeat from the factory office, and though meant in jest, no one laughed. Control that quiet, that pervasive, could never truly be funny. The illusion of paradise shattered most sharply during the panic of the 1890s. Wages plummeted as the company struggled, but rent stayed the same. Pullman's managers argued the town could not be degraded by lowering its standards. That argument sounded noble to shareholders. To workers, it was a death sentence. Men who had once admired the roses planted along the walkways now watched their children go hungry while the company still demanded full payment for polished floors and trimmed lawns. Beauty became bitter. Order became suffocation. The perfect streets began to feel like the hallways of a gilded prison, and yet Pullman still insisted the town was a gift, a benevolent model for the future. He walked through its spotless streets proud of what he had created, unaware that the same cobblestones he admired echoed with the quiet resentment growing among thousands of workers. To him, dissatisfaction meant ingratitude. To them, his pride was a reminder that he valued the appearance of their lives more than the lives themselves. Slowly, the truth settled over the workers like a heavy fog. They were not residents, they were exhibits. The town was a museum of ordered labor, and they were the silent proof that Pullman's vision worked. Every house, every school, every garden was part of a script written by a man who believed he understood them better than they understood themselves. But no paradise built on control can last forever, and in the shadows of those perfect streets, the first embers of rebellion quietly began to glow. When the economic panic of 1893 struck America, it moved like a silent plague. No flames, no storms, no collapsing buildings, just a slow, merciless suffocation that reached into every factory, every street, every kitchen table. Railroads closed, banks fell, jobs vanished. But in the town of Pullman, the panic felt different. It did not arrive as chaos, it arrived as a tightening. Quiet at first, so subtle that workers could not pinpoint the moment when the air began to thin. The Pullman Palace Car Company had been bleeding money as rail demand collapsed, and George Pullman, always obsessed with protecting his empire, believed he had no choice but to slash wages. It was presented as a temporary measure, a necessary sacrifice. But when pay envelopes arrived and workers unfolded the papers inside, their hearts sank. Some men saw their wages cut by 25%, others by 40%, a few by over half. Hours were reduced without notice. Bonuses disappeared. The overtime that once kept families afloat evaporated overnight. Men who once walked into the factory with confidence now stepped through the gates carrying fear in their pockets. Yet the rent never changed. The same company that paid their shrunken wages still demanded full rent for the company-owned homes. The same homes they could be evicted from with a single warning letter. The same perfect, pristine houses that now felt like stones tied to their ankles. Pullman officials offered no compassion, no debate, and no compromise. The town's beauty had rules, they said, and rules could not bend to economic hardship. The lawns still had to be trimmed, the streets had to remain spotless, the buildings had to be maintained at a standard that impressed visitors. Even as workers stood in food lines or pawned wedding rings, Pullman's managers recited the same explanation: rents cannot be lowered. But people did not eat manicured lawns. Children could not sleep on standards. Families found themselves trapped in an impossible equation. Wages had fallen so sharply that many owed more in rent than they earned in an entire month. Some fathers worked 20 days and came home owing the company money. Mothers quietly sold the few belongings they had, a sewing needle, a pan, a handmade quilt, hoping it would stretch the next week. In the evenings, men gathered in dark kitchens and spoke in hushed voices about the growing impossibility of survival. Their anger simmered beneath a layer of shame, because Pullman had crafted the illusion that he had rescued them from slums. And now, even as they starved, they were told to be grateful. Every day became a choice between humiliation and hunger. Workers begged for negotiations, asking Pullman to lower rents until the economy improved. He refused, not once, not for anyone. He believed lowering rents would tarnish the reputation of his town. He believed maintaining appearances was more important than maintaining lives. The workers realized with devastating clarity that the town they lived in was designed not for their comfort, but for his pride. In some homes, children cried through the night from emptiness. Mothers watered down soup until it was nothing more than warm liquid, stirring it slowly so it lasted longer. Proud men who had built luxury train cars with their hands now pulled vegetables from garbage piles behind the market. Others swallowed their dignity and asked relatives in Chicago for leftover scraps. Winter burned their lungs. Rent notices piled like threats on their tables. A few families quietly packed their belongings and left the town, leaving behind unpaid debt, broken dreams, and houses that now stood like abandoned shells, too perfect on the outside, hollow and cold within. But most workers stayed, not because they wanted to, but because leaving Pullman meant entering a job market that had collapsed nationwide. There were no factory doors waiting open for them outside the town's borders. There were no promises, no safety nets, no second chances. They stayed because staying was the only way to keep their children from freezing. They stayed even as it broke them. The final blow came when men discovered that Pullman's company store had quietly raised prices. Bread cost more, flour cost more, coal, essential for surviving winter, became painfully expensive. The company store's windows shone with goods, but people walked past them like ghosts, knowing they could not afford anything inside. The workers no longer felt like citizens of a model town. They felt like livestock being squeezed for profit in a cage disguised as paradise. As the suffering deepened, the town acquired a new sound, something Pullman had not designed, the sound of murmured resentment, growing steadily in kitchens, workshops, boarding houses, and factory corners. Workers who had once defended Pullman's dream now spoke openly about his betrayal. A few whispered that the company was acting like a landlord fattening his pockets on the backs of starving men. Others said they felt like prisoners in a town that was supposed to save them. The turning point came when a group of workers visited Pullman himself, begging not for charity but for fairness. They explained the impossible math, that wages had been sliced to bone while rent remained untouched. They asked him to see their empty tables, their hungry children, their wives who took in endless laundry to survive. Pullman listened, expression cold, his pride sealing off any trace of empathy. Then he refused. He refused every request. He refused the reality of their suffering. He refused to acknowledge that his model town, the jewel of his legacy, had become a nightmare. The delegation left his office not defeated, but awakened. For the first time, they understood that Pullman was not their benevolent creator, he was the architect of their misery. And as word of his refusal spread across the town, the workers felt a fire rising among them. It began in whispers, then it became conversations, then meetings, then plans. The panic had taken their wages, their security, and their hope, but now it had given them something new, a reason to rise. When the suffering in Pullman grew too heavy to swallow, something shifted in the air, slowly at first, like a floorboard creaking under weight. It started with a man refusing overtime not because he was tired, but because he finally realized his labor fed a machine that no longer cared if he lived. Then a woman slammed her window shut when a company inspector tried to enter without knocking. A teenage boy handed back a rent notice and said nothing, but the look in his eyes said everything. These tiny acts of defiance were not planned. They were sparks, flickers in the dark, and like sparks, they drifted from house to house until they found dry grass. The first true blaze ignited in the factory yard, when a worker named Henry Caldwell, usually quiet, obedient, one of the good men, stood in the middle of the yard and said, loud enough for every foreman to hear, "We can't breathe anymore." It was a simple sentence, but in that moment everyone felt it. The workday stopped, machines slowed, eyes turned, the foreman, confused and offended, barked orders. But something in Caldwell's voice had cracked open the truth. When he refused to return to his machine, daring the company to discipline him, dozens of workers stepped back from theirs too. Not in rebellion yet, no one dared say that word, but in a silent, collective pause that felt like a held breath before a storm. That pause spread. Every worker who watched Caldwell realized he had spoken the sentence stuck in all their throats. For months they had swallowed humiliation, deprivation, hunger, and fear. But a man pushed to the brink becomes unpredictable, and a community pushed together becomes unstoppable. Caldwell's defiance rippled through Pullman like a pulse. In kitchens, women whispered that the men were planning to meet. In the boarding houses, young factory workers slipped out after dark, heading to secret gatherings in abandoned storerooms, basements, and the back rooms of taverns outside company borders. At these gatherings, men spoke with voices trembling, not from fear, but from the shock of finally expressing what they had buried. They talked about wages slashed to bone, rents that choked them like ropes, and the cold refusal they had received from Pullman himself. Some cried. A few pounded their fists on tables. One man stood up and revealed he had lost 2 children that winter because he couldn't afford coal, and that the company had still demanded rent for the days his home sat cold while his children shivered to death. Silence filled the room after that. Not the silence of fear, the silence of awakening. They began to ask themselves questions no one had dared speak aloud before. What happens if we walk out? What if the machines go quiet? What if the rail cars stop rolling? What if the model town becomes a model failure? Their fear began to loosen its grip. In its place grew something dangerous, powerful, and new: solidarity. The spark that Caldwell had lit, unintentionally, instinctively, grew into a flame when the workers realized their misery was shared by every family in town. Misery that is shared becomes fuel. People who suffer alone collapse. People who suffer together rise. And in Pullman, the rising had begun. Meetings grew larger. A representative group formed, men who carried the burdens of hundreds of voices. They practiced speaking, learned to vote, learned to argue, learned to stand their ground. They were factory workers, not politicians, but hardship had forged in them a sharp intelligence born of necessity. They compiled grievances in careful lists: wages, rents, inspections, fines, the cruel imbalance of corporate control, and with each meeting the tone changed. What started as exhaustion became frustration. Frustration hardened into anger, and anger sharpened into resolve. They sent one final delegation to Pullman, not to plead but to demand. They walked through the model town with heads high, knowing the company's spies were watching, knowing the town officials were already preparing their denial. When they stood before George Pullman, they spoke not as individuals but as the voice of thousands. They explained the starvation, the impossible math, the despair bleeding through every street of the town he claimed to love. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Pullman looked into their faces and realized they were no longer afraid. For a man who thrived on control, that was the beginning of panic. But still, he refused. Still, he lectured them about dignity, order, standards. Still, he spoke like a father scolding children instead of a businessman responsible for human lives. And as they walked out of his office, one man whispered, "He will not help us. He never will." The others nodded. The spark became a flame. When the delegation returned to the workers, their message spread faster than news of the wage cuts had months earlier. House to house, shop to shop, street to street, the word passed. There will be no mercy. Not from Pullman, not from the company. If change was going to come, it would not come from above. The only remaining power was the one they had never used. Their labor, the fire lit in the hearts of Pullman's workers, soon reached the attention of outsiders. Leaders of the American Railway Union, men who had seen strikes, victories, and failures, heard whispers of a company town squeezing its workers to death. They saw a group of factory men with no voice, no rights, and no hope. And they recognized something they could not ignore, the beginning of a movement. When Eugene V Debs himself stepped into the conversation, everything changed. He listened, not like Pullman, with cold politeness, but with real understanding. When he told the workers that unity was stronger than fear, they believed him. When he said they were not alone, they felt the ground shift beneath their feet. And when he promised that the American Railway Union would stand with them, the flame that had begun as a spark in Caldwell's voice roared into a fire visible across the nation. The workers of Pullman, once silent shadows in their own town, now prepared to take the one step that would alter the course of American labor forever. They would stop the machines. They would walk out. They would ignite a rebellion. George Pullman never believed the day would come when the men who built his empire would stand against him, not with fists alone, but with something far more dangerous: unity. Keynote 4 unfolds at the boiling point of this unity, when workers who once whispered behind factory doors began to speak loudly in saloons, boarding houses, kitchens, and union halls. It was the moment the rebellion stopped being an idea and became a living organism, pulsing through Chicago like a fever. The Pullman Strike did not erupt from sudden rage. It grew slowly, through nights of hunger, humiliations swallowed, and the sharp realization that a man could work 12 hours a day and still not earn enough to feed his children. George Pullman had crafted a company town that he believed would be his masterpiece: orderly streets, trimmed lawns, strict rules, and workers living under what he called moral discipline. But what he created instead was a cage, and in 1894, those inside finally realized they were not living in a model town. They were living in a velvet prison. The workers reached a breaking point when Pullman slashed wages by nearly 30%, while refusing to reduce the rent in his company-owned housing. Men who had repaired rail cars for years, whose hands were permanently scarred from coupling iron and steel, found themselves unable to afford bread. The same town that forced them to pay for Pullman-approved groceries also forbade them from meeting in public to discuss grievances. Even in their own homes, workers felt watched. There were inspectors walking streets, noting bad influences, reporting anyone who questioned authority. It was a world built on the illusion of care, hiding a machinery of control. And when men began to speak of revolt, they lowered their voices because they truly believed the walls of the town could hear. But hunger is a more powerful force than fear. When payday arrived and some workers found envelopes containing nothing, no coin, no note, just emptiness, those men returned home with faces so pale their wives understood before they even spoke. Something inside the community snapped that night. The anger that had simmered for months ignited. Workers gathered in darkened yards, speaking in urgent whispers. Some argued for caution, afraid of being blacklisted. Others insisted there was no turning back. They had nothing left to lose. The idea of rebellion traveled like a current, invisible but electric. By morning it had a shape, a voice, and a direction. This was the moment when the American Railway Union entered the story, a force that Pullman had not taken seriously until it was too late. Eugene Debs and the union leaders listened to the workers' grievances and realized the truth. This was not simply a dispute between employer and employee. It was the opening chapter of a much larger battle over dignity, rights, and the power of labor in a rapidly industrializing nation. Debs advised negotiation first, but Pullman refused to even meet with the workers. He locked his office doors, claiming management decisions were not open for discussion. That refusal became the spark that lit the fuse. When the Pullman workers walked out, they expected retaliation. What they didn't expect was the tidal wave of solidarity that swept across the country. The union called for a boycott of all trains carrying Pullman cars, and workers, switchmen, brakemen, firemen, engineers, stood shoulder to shoulder. Rail lines slowed, then halted, until nearly half the nation's freight traffic came to a standstill. It was one of the most powerful displays of worker unity in American history. And for the first time, George Pullman felt fear. Chicago became the beating heart of the rebellion. Streets filled with angry, hungry workers demanding justice. Strikers patrolled the yards, ensuring trains with Pullman cars remained motionless. Families gathered outside in support, some bringing food, others simply lending their presence as silent witnesses. It was a moment when the ordinary became extraordinary. Men who had always believed themselves powerless suddenly realized they held the entire railway system in their hands. Pullman, outraged, called upon railroad executives, who in turn pressured the federal government. Newspapers, many funded by railroad interests, published stories portraying the workers as radicals and criminals. They painted Debs as a dangerous agitator. But workers on the ground knew better. They were fighting not for chaos but for survival. When federal troops were sent to Chicago under the pretext of protecting mail routes, the rebellion entered a new, darker phase. Soldiers marched into the rail yards with rifles fixed, bayonets gleaming. Workers stared back with empty stomachs and angry eyes. The confrontation was inevitable. The first clashes were not coordinated. They erupted spontaneously when troops attempted to move trains the workers had sworn to keep still. Stones were thrown, shots were fired, smoke rose from burning rail cars. The city trembled as working men who had spent their lives being told to be obedient finally stood against the might of industry and government. The strike began as an economic dispute, but by Keynote 4, it had become something bigger, a battle for respect, identity, and the right to challenge a system that crushed the common man. The tragedy of it all was that despite the unity and courage of the workers, the forces aligned against them were too powerful. But the legacy of that rebellion, the bravery of ordinary men, the solidarity shown in the face of starvation, the willingness to fight for fairness, would outlive Pullman's empire. It marked the beginning of a new era in labor history, one shaped not by submission, but by resistance. By the time the strike reached its midpoint, a shift occurred that no one, neither the workers nor the government, could fully control. Keynote 5 captures the moment when the Pullman Rebellion stopped being merely a protest of railway laborers and transformed into a nationwide test of power between ordinary citizens and the machinery of American authority. The Union had intended for the boycott to be peaceful. Eugene Debs himself preached discipline, restraint, and dignity. He believed that if workers held their ground with calm determination, the moral burden would fall upon Pullman and the railroad corporations. But when federal troops poured into Chicago, the moral landscape shifted. The workers felt the presence of bayonets, and the city understood that the government was not neutral. It stood with wealth, industry, and the corporate elite. The rebellion that followed was not planned. It was born from anger, humiliation, and the feeling of being cornered. At first, the troops moved quietly through the city, marching in rows beneath the steel sky. But the moment soldiers arrived at the rail yards, everything changed. Workers who had waited peacefully now watched men in uniform, rifles polished, boots heavy on the gravel moving toward the trains the strikers had fought to keep motionless. The order was simple: move the Pullman cars at any cost. The workers' response was equally simple: they would not allow it. But when the soldiers began forcing couplers apart and clearing the rails, the spark of conflict ignited into flame. What followed was less a planned uprising and more a storm of human emotion, years of exploitation bursting loose like thunder. Some workers picked up stones, others formed human chains to block the tracks. And in the heart of Chicago, tension spilled into violence. A single confrontation between soldiers and a group of switchmen set off a chain reaction. The soldiers shoved one man aside, Another threw a handful of dirt. A bayonet flashed. Then a bottle sailed through the air, shattering against a rail car. The sound echoed like the crack of a rifle, and suddenly the city was roaring. Crowds surged forward. Soldiers raised guns. The first shot fired was lost in the chaos, but the consequences rippled outward. The rebellion had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The newspapers blamed the workers instantly. Headlines screamed of rioting mobs, lawless agitators, and socialist menace. Yet the truth, witnessed by the people living through it, was that the escalation came not from wanton destruction but from deep frustration. Men pushed too far, families hungry too long, dignity bruised too often. Every angry shout came from a voice that had been silenced for years. Every stone thrown came from a hand that had been forced into labor for pennies. The city had become a powder keg, and the arrival of federal troops was the spark that set it ablaze. As thousands joined the protests, Chicago transformed into a battlefield. Rail cars were overturned and set on fire, illuminating the night sky in orange glow. Smoke curled into the clouds, and sparks drifted on the wind like fireflies from hell. Workers tried to shield union leaders from blame, insisting the anger belonged to the people, not to Debs or the ARU. But government officials had already made their decision. This was an insurrection, and it had to be crushed. More troops arrived. More guns pointed at men who had never held one themselves. The city trembled under the weight of this confrontation, as if steel and brick could feel the strain of human suffering. Families watched from windows, holding children close as troops marched past. Women begged their husbands not to go back to the rail yards. But hunger has a voice louder than caution. A man stared into the eyes of his starving child and understood that he had no choice but to keep fighting. A rebellion, once born, does not shrink back into silence simply because steel helmets appear. It grows, feeding on the pain that created it. Amid the chaos, Eugene Debs walked through the streets like a man carrying the weight of the nation on his shoulders. He pleaded with workers to stay peaceful, reminding them that their strength lay in unity, not destruction. But Debs also saw what many did not. The government had no intention of negotiating. It had chosen force. And once that choice was made, the workers' restraint became irrelevant. Debs looked into the faces of the men in the streets, eyes filled with exhaustion, cheeks hollow from hunger, and he realized that the rebellion had gained a life of its own. It was no longer something he could control. The railroad companies fed the flames, hiring strikebreakers who worked under military protection. These men, escorted through crowds at gunpoint, became symbols of betrayal. Workers saw them not as fellow laborers, but as knives being driven into their struggle. Fights broke out. Rail yards became war zones. Every attempt to move a train turned into a clash between desperate workers and heavily armed troops. The rhythm of Chicago changed. The sounds of industry, hammer, whistle, steam, were replaced by shouts, boots, breaking glass, and the steady march of soldiers. And through it all, George Pullman watched from a safe distance. He saw the rebellion as proof that workers could not be trusted with freedom. He felt no guilt for the suffering his decisions caused. In his mind, he was defending order, discipline, and the sanctity of private enterprise. He did not understand that the rebellion was not born from radicals, nor from agitators, but from the very conditions he imposed. That blindness would follow him to his grave. By the height of the conflict, Chicago was in chaos. Roads blocked, trains burning, soldiers everywhere. The Pullman Rebellion had become something monumental, something America had never seen before, a working-class uprising so vast that it rippled through the entire country. It forced the nation to confront an uncomfortable truth: that industrial progress built on the backs of suffering men would always carry the risk of revolt. This was the turning point, the moment when the rebellion became a war of wills, a clash between hunger and authority, between human dignity and corporate power. It was raw, uncontrolled, and unforgettable. And though the workers did not yet know it, the outcome of this conflict would reshape the future of American labor forever, even as it demanded a terrible price in the present. As the rebellion reached its fiercest stage, another force began shaping the story, one far quieter than gunfire but far more devastating in its impact: the machinery of truth, twisted and weaponized by those in power. Keynote 6 revolves around the media war that erupted during the Pullman Rebellion, a battle not fought with rifles or bayonets but with ink, lies, and carefully engineered narratives designed to crush the workers' spirit from within. It was a conflict where perception mattered more than fact, where the victory of one side depended on making the other appear monstrous. And in this arena, the corporations held every advantage. From the beginning, the newspapers were never neutral. Most major publications were funded by wealthy industrialists who shared Pullman's worldview. Order must be preserved, profits must be protected, and workers must know their place. When the strike began, the press downplayed it as a minor disturbance, a nuisance, an inconvenience to business rather than a cry for justice. But as the rebellion spread across the nation and trains ground to a halt, the tone shifted dramatically. Headlines became weapons. Mob rule in Chicago, revolution on the rails, Debs threatens American stability. Each word was chosen to stir fear in households far from the rail yards, turning men fighting for bread into symbols of chaos. Inside Chicago, workers gathered around cheap newspapers and felt the sting of betrayal in every line. They read accusations that they were violent radicals, foreign agitators, criminals disguised as laborers. Some saw claims that the union was plotting to overthrow the government. Others read false stories of workers burning civilian homes and attacking innocent bystanders, events that had never occurred. In the heart of these lies lived a simple strategy: make the public hate the strikers so deeply that the government could justify any force used against them. For the workers, this was psychological warfare. Many of them had never been mentioned in a newspaper before. Their names, their faces, their struggles had always been invisible. Now, suddenly, the entire nation knew about them, but only as villains. It was a strange, painful transformation. A switchman who had spent years risking his life on unstable tracks was now labeled a violent anarchist. A father who wanted fair wages was now called a threat to American freedom. A young man who had never lifted a hand against anyone was accused of being part of a murderous mob. The dissonance tore at their spirits. Mothers felt fear creep into their kitchens. Unsure whether their husbands would be safe that night, children asked why the papers called their fathers criminals. And the workers themselves, already struggling with hunger and exhaustion, now faced a new kind of torment, the feeling that their nation had turned against them. Even people in Chicago who had initially supported the strike slowly began to waver, unsure what to believe. The newspapers painted such vivid pictures of danger that many civilians began locking their doors at night, worrying that the mobs might spill into the streets. It didn't matter that most of the violence came from the soldiers and the corporate guards. In print, the workers were always the villains. The press even targeted Eugene Debs directly, calling him a delusional radical, a socialist menace, a man determined to tear apart the fabric of America. They wrote that he sought power, not justice. They accused him of manipulating the workers for political gain, twisting his every word into proof of treachery. Debs knew the truth, but he also understood the power of public opinion. If the people believed he was dangerous, then the government would have the cover it needed to crush the union once and for all. To fight back, Debs and the ARU held public meetings where they read the newspapers aloud and exposed the lies printed within. Workers roared in frustration, demanding that their side of the story be told. Debs sent letters to the editors, correcting inaccuracies, pleading for honesty. But the press ignored or mocked him. Truth was not profitable. Fear was, and fear sold newspapers by the millions. While the newspapers wrote of violent mobs, the soldiers filling Chicago's streets acted with impunity. They fired into crowds, beat unarmed men, and dragged workers from their homes for questioning. Yet these actions rarely appeared in print. When they did, the articles framed them as necessary acts of patriotism. Violence by the workers was condemned, violence by the troops was celebrated. This double standard cut deep, convincing the workers that justice was not blind. It simply looked away from their suffering. In the midst of this media storm, rumors spread like wildfire. Stories circulated that federal troops planned mass arrests. Others said Pullman had evidence that would put Debs in prison for life. Workers didn't know what to believe, but every rumor fueled anxiety. Desperation seeped into their conversations. Some argued they should escalate the rebellion, give the press a real story to fear. Others pleaded for calm, terrified that if they gave the newspapers even a flicker of truth to their lies, the government would unleash even more brutal force. The most painful part for many workers was seeing neighbors turn against them. People who had once greeted them warmly now looked away or stepped aside in the street. Shopkeepers refused credit. Landlords threatened eviction. The newspapers had done their job. They had reshaped the city's perception of an entire class of people. And perception, once hardened, becomes nearly impossible to crack. Debs realized then that the strike was no longer merely a struggle for workers' rights. It had become a public relations war. The corporations didn't need to defeat the workers in the streets. They needed only to convince America that the workers deserved defeat. And as long as the newspapers printed lies, the workers stood on the losing side of that battlefield. Even in the worst moments, however, a quiet resilience remained. Workers began writing their own accounts, scribbling letters, recording memories. Some spoke to sympathetic journalists who dared defy their publishers. The truth found cracks to slip through, though not nearly fast enough to stop the damage. But the workers learned something crucial. Power isn't only about guns or money, it is also about who controls the narrative. And in that realization, the seeds of future labor movements were planted, movements that would grow to challenge the lies that had suffocated the Pullman strikers. In the end, Keynote 6 marks the moment when the rebellion entered the realm of national mythology, shaped not by what happened, but by what Americans were told happened. It became a lesson carved into history, that the most dangerous weapon in a conflict is often the one that never fires a shot. By the time the Pullman strike had reached its boiling point, the true cost of rebellion became impossible to ignore. Keynote 7 captures the human suffering, the blood, the fire, and the shadows of despair that accompanied the strike's physical confrontations. It was one thing to hear about wages cut or rent left unpaid. It was another to witness families trembling in their homes, children shivering in the cold, and men beaten by the very soldiers who had sworn to protect them. The strike, which had begun as an economic protest, had become a crucible in which the spirit of every worker, every family, every neighborhood in Pullman was tested. When the federal troops arrived, they moved with calculated efficiency, their boots pounding the gravel streets, rifles glinting in the sun. The men who had built Pullman's luxury railcars were no longer laborers. They were now symbols of defiance, and the soldiers had orders to break them. The first clash came in a sudden surge, a mixture of fear and anger. A train loaded with Pullman cars attempted to leave the yard. Workers blocked the tracks, forming chains of determination, while soldiers pushed forward. The collision was inevitable. Shouts rose above the whistle of the engines, rocks were thrown, the air filled with the acrid scent of smoke, dust, and tension. In an instant, the streets that once echoed with the rhythm of ordinary life became a battlefield. Families huddled behind locked doors, windows shut tight, hearts racing with every sound of gunfire or shouting. Mothers whispered prayers for their husbands and sons, while children clutched blankets and stuffed toys, trying to feel the illusion of safety. Elderly neighbors peered through cracks in shutters, hoping to witness a resolution without tragedy. But tragedy did not wait. Soldiers, trained for obedience, advanced without hesitation. And the workers, pushed beyond endurance, fought back, not with strategy, but with raw survival instinct. Every confrontation left marks on the streets and on the people, bruised bodies, bleeding faces, scorched railcars, overturned wagons. The psychological weight of the rebellion grew heavier than the physical toll. For the first time, many workers understood that resistance carried consequences beyond the immediate. Those who were arrested faced harsh jail conditions. Some were beaten before they even reached the cells. Others were dragged through the streets, humiliated in front of their families. The children saw their fathers returned home with bloodied hands and faces swollen from blows. In kitchens and basements, whispers spoke of men who had been struck down simply for standing up to injustice. Hunger, cold, and fear now combined with the terror of violence that came from no one's imagination. It was real, palpable, relentless. The city's infrastructure began to fray. Trains halted not because the workers wanted to cripple commerce, but because no one could safely operate them under armed surveillance. Goods that fed towns far beyond Chicago piled up in yards. Mail deliveries stopped. Businesses that depended on the rails suffered. The economic strain spread outward, creating ripple effects that only deepened the crisis. Yet, despite these hardships, workers remained resolute. They had tasted the power of unity, of collective defiance, and they understood that retreating would guarantee nothing but continued oppression. The human body could endure hunger, cold, and fear, but surrender meant the death of dignity itself. News of casualties, men killed in clashes, others fatally wounded by stampeding trains or rifles, reached families with slow, agonizing clarity. In small apartments and crowded boarding houses, the grief was overwhelming. Husbands mourned wives, wives mourned husbands, children mourned parents. Every loss became a story whispered from one worker to another, spreading the knowledge that no one in Pullman would escape unscathed. The rebellion was not abstract. It was written in blood, echoed in sobs, and etched into the eyes of every living participant. Yet, amid the suffering, moments of courage and solidarity emerged. Men carried the injured to safety, women smuggled food into the yards, and neighbors risked confrontation to protect each other from soldiers' wrath. In these acts, the rebellion gained moral clarity, a reminder that even when the stakes were life and death, humanity could endure. The workers were not faceless rioters. They were parents, siblings, sons, daughters, neighbors. Their struggle was intimate, immediate, and profound. And still, the confrontation escalated. Soldiers enforced order with brutality that seemed designed to terrify. Factory gates were barricaded, windows broken, fires ignited either intentionally or accidentally. Smoke filled the streets, mixing with the scent of iron and coal. Every moment became a test of patience, of endurance, of courage. Yet the workers endured, propelled by desperation, by solidarity, and by the knowledge that their oppression had reached its apex. They had nothing left to lose and everything to gain: respect, dignity, and perhaps the chance to be seen not as tools of industry, but as human beings. In the end, Keynote 7 captures a paradox: rebellion as both tragedy and triumph. It was tragedy in the suffering, in the lives disrupted, in the blood spilt. But it was triumph in the unity of people who refused to be invisible, in the courage of ordinary men and women facing extraordinary power, in the demonstration that collective human will could challenge the mightiest institutions. The streets of Pullman bore witness to this struggle, every brick and cobblestone absorbing the sounds, the cries, and the anger. And when the smoke eventually cleared, the memory of suffering and bravery would endure longer than the physical scars. The workers learned a crucial lesson during this crucible of fire and blood. Power could crush the body, intimidate the mind, and destroy property, but it could not entirely crush the human spirit, when that spirit found strength in solidarity. And in the shadows of burned rail cars, scorched streets, and broken windows, the story of courage, endurance, and rebellion became immortal, a living memory to inspire labor struggles for generations to come. As the Pullman Strike dragged on, a new dimension of the struggle emerged, one that went beyond streets, rail cars, or even physical confrontation. Keynote 8 centers on the unseen, quiet battles fought in homes, kitchens, and back alleys, battles waged by the families of workers, by the women and children who endured hunger, fear, and uncertainty, while their fathers, husbands, and brothers stood on the front lines. The rebellion was no longer merely a public spectacle. It had become an intimate war fought in the most personal spaces imaginable, a war in which survival, dignity, and the hope for justice collided. While the soldiers occupied the yards and the newspapers shaped perception, the civilians of Pullman carried their own kind of rebellion within the confines of domestic life. Women bore the brunt of the hardship in ways that were invisible to most observers. They rationed food with meticulous care, stretching thin soups and watered-down meals to feed children who were too young to understand the political and economic forces that dictated their lives. Every loaf of bread became a negotiation. Every scoop of porridge was measured not only for sustenance, but to conserve energy for the coming days. Mothers became strategists, planners, and accountants, calculating how to survive week to week, often without the comfort of sleep or rest. The rebellion's public face was in the streets, but at home, women fought an equally grueling campaign, balancing desperation with courage. Children, too, became participants, even without knowledge of the larger political forces at play. They learned early that hunger was a constant companion, that the absence of a father or older brother meant waiting by the window for news, that silence could be as heavy as shouting. Yet in the midst of deprivation, moments of resilience appeared. A small child sharing a morsel with a sibling, an older sister improvising games to distract younger children from the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. A quiet act of tenderness that reminded everyone that life and humanity persisted, even in the shadow of despair. The rebellion, it turned out, was not confined to the rail yards. It had invaded homes, hearts, and the very fabric of daily existence. As reports of violence and arrests reached these households, fear mixed with determination. Mothers grieved quietly, knowing that a husband or son might not return from a confrontation with soldiers. Fathers, when they could call home, spoke in hushed tones, sharing information that balanced warning with encouragement. The family unit became both a support system and a crucible, teaching endurance, sacrifice, and the necessity of faith in collective strength. The strike was no longer just a political movement, it had become a deeply human story, one where every life touched by oppression carried stakes far greater than pay or property. They carried legacy, survival, and memory. The psychological toll was immense. Families felt invisible, trapped in a narrative controlled by newspapers and officials who portrayed the strikers as criminals while ignoring the suffering of those left behind. Rumors circulated, some terrifyingly plausible, that soldiers would search homes for agitators, that young men might be dragged into jails without trial, that property could be seized without notice. Every knock on the door, every stranger in the street became a potential threat. The Pullman women learned to be vigilant, inventive, and resilient. They became couriers of information, whispering warnings between neighbors, sending messages to those engaged in the strike, and ensuring that the rebellion's communications survived even under constant threat. The experience forged unexpected bonds. Women from different households, who might never have spoken under normal circumstances, collaborated to distribute food, hide families from inspectors, and provide emotional support. Communities, previously divided by class or neighborhood rivalries, discovered unity through shared suffering. Each act of solidarity, small though it might seem, became a cornerstone of resistance. It was a rebellion of the domestic sphere, quieter than the battles in the streets, but no less crucial in shaping the ultimate endurance of the workers' cause. Economic desperation further intensified the home front struggle. With wages frozen and resources stretched thin, families made decisions of impossible morality, selling cherished possessions to afford medicine, letting windows remain broken to save money, or rationing warmth by huddling together in freezing rooms. The rebellion forced ordinary people into extraordinary measures, blurring the line between survival and sacrifice. Every choice weighed heavily, a daily negotiation between necessity and principle. Yet amidst this darkness, human courage emerged. Mothers defied soldiers when they dared enter homes. Older children risked punishment by carrying messages between households. Even the smallest acts, whispered warnings, hidden food, quiet prayers, were forms of resistance. These acts sustained the rebellion, not just materially but morally. They reminded the strikers in the streets that the fight was not for abstract rights alone. It was for the survival and dignity of the people they loved. The domestic resistance gave the public rebellion a pulse, a heartbeat that kept it alive even as soldiers and courts sought to crush it. Keynote 8 also underscores the profound psychological endurance required. The families endured uncertainty, constantly recalculating risks, preparing for the possibility of sudden violence or eviction. They maintained hope in a situation designed to break them. Their endurance became a silent force behind the workers' courage, a constant reminder that the strike's significance extended beyond the factory walls. Every mother who rationed food, every child who learned patience through necessity, every neighbor who shared a hidden loaf of bread reinforced the collective determination to survive and to see the rebellion through to its ultimate consequences. By the end of the strike, the toll was evident. Homes were damaged, families were broken, and many lives had been permanently altered. Yet the rebellion's legacy lived not only in political outcomes or labor law advancements, but in the personal histories of those who had endured the home front struggle. It was a reminder that revolutions are not fought solely in streets or boardrooms. They are fought in kitchens, bedrooms, and hidden corners of daily life. The courage of ordinary families sustained extraordinary resistance, leaving a mark on history that statistics or newspaper accounts could never fully capture. The struggle of the home front in Pullman revealed a profound truth. Rebellion is as much about surviving with dignity as it is about fighting for rights. In every whispered conversation, every shared ration, every calculated risk, the families of Pullman wrote an untold chapter of the strike. Their lives became proof that the human spirit, when united by love, necessity, and courage, could endure horrors that would crush the strongest individual. Keynote 8, in its entirety, captures the invisible backbone of the Pullman Strike, the domestic resistance that shaped the rebellion's endurance, moral clarity, and historical significance. As the Pullman Strike neared its final stages, the city of Chicago had become a theater of tension, chaos, and anticipation. Keynote 9 delves into the mounting political pressure, the involvement of federal authorities, and the sense of inevitability that gripped both workers and government alike. By now, the strike was no longer a localized labor dispute. It had become a national crisis, a symbol of the growing power of organized labor and a test for the federal government's willingness to intervene in the affairs of industry. Every move, every decision, every headline carried weight far beyond the rail yards and streets of Pullman, shaping the outcome in ways both immediate and historic. The federal government, under President Grover Cleveland, had initially hesitated, hoping the strike would subside through negotiation or exhaustion. But as news of halted trains, blocked mail, and growing unrest reached Washington, the administration realized that inaction could threaten both commerce and public perception. The moment had arrived to assert authority. Troops were mobilized, and federal marshals were sent to Chicago under orders to protect the railroads, ensure the passage of mail, and suppress the rebellion by any means necessary. The message was clear: the nation would not tolerate disruption of its industrial arteries, yet this decisive move also carried enormous risk. The soldiers were outsiders, unfamiliar with the streets, the neighborhoods, and the people they now confronted. Any misstep could inflame the situation beyond control. For the workers, the arrival of federal troops signaled a point of no return. Months of frustration, hunger, and humiliation had built an undercurrent of defiance. Now, that undercurrent became a visible force. They realized that they were no longer simply negotiating with George Pullman or his company. They were facing the full might of the federal government. This knowledge was terrifying, yet it also galvanized them. If they succumbed now, all the sacrifices, the injuries, the nights of sleepless planning would be meaningless. If they stood their ground, they might endure further suffering, but they would also affirm the principle that labor could resist oppression. The confrontations escalated quickly. Streets that had been quiet during the early days of the strike now rang with the sound of boots, shouts, and the occasional gunshot. Workers tried to block trains, often facing soldiers with rifles at the ready. The presence of firearms and bayonets heightened every encounter. A single misstep could result in injury or death, yet the workers remained defiant. Their courage was rooted in more than just anger. It was rooted in necessity, dignity, and the knowledge that their plight represented the struggles of laborers nationwide. Each act of resistance sent a ripple through the city, inspiring some, terrifying others, and forcing the authorities to reconsider their tactics. Political leaders outside of Chicago began to weigh in as well. Newspapers across the nation debated the legitimacy of the strike, the morality of federal intervention, and the broader implications for labor rights. Editorials painted the workers as radicals or heroes, depending on the author's perspective. This media storm influenced public perception, creating both sympathy and hostility for the strikers. Families in distant cities followed the unfolding events, realizing that the struggle in Pullman could set precedents for labor disputes across the country. Every headline, every telegram, every official report became part of a larger narrative about power, justice, and the rights of workers. Amid this intense scrutiny, Eugene Debs and the leadership of the American Railway Union faced a delicate balancing act. They needed to maintain solidarity among thousands of workers while preventing reckless actions that could justify violent suppression. Debs traveled between neighborhoods, communicating with local committees, reinforcing discipline, and reminding workers that their strength lay in unity rather than chaos. Yet even with careful planning, the situation was unpredictable. Ordinary men, driven by fear, hunger, or anger, sometimes acted impulsively. Each incident risked providing the government with a justification for harsher measures, but inaction was equally dangerous. The leaders understood that the stakes were enormous, and every decision carried weighty consequences. By this point, the strike had begun to influence the broader economy. Freight delays affected goods across multiple states, while halted trains disrupted mail delivery and commerce. Industrialists and politicians grew increasingly anxious, fearing that the disruption could inspire other workers to emulate the Pullman example. This amplified the sense of urgency within the federal government. which now viewed the strike as a potential threat to national stability. The military presence in Chicago was reinforced, with additional troops arriving to ensure compliance and to intimidate strikers. Every day became a tense standoff, with both sides aware that escalation could be catastrophic. Despite these pressures, the workers' resolve remained strong. They were no longer just a group of laborers fighting for wages. They had become symbols of resistance against industrial exploitation and governmental overreach. Their struggle represented the broader labor movement, and they understood that their actions would be judged not only in Chicago but across the nation. This awareness added weight to every decision, every act of defiance, every strike of the picket. It was a struggle not only for immediate survival but for historical significance, a battle in which ordinary people were asked to embody extraordinary courage. Tragically, the human cost continued to rise. Clashes with federal troops resulted in injuries and deaths, leaving families devastated. Some workers were imprisoned, often without trial, while others faced fines or eviction. Yet each act of repression reinforced the resolve of the remaining strikers. They recognized that the forces arrayed against them were vast and powerful, but they also realized that surrender would mean the loss of dignity and the erasure of their struggle from history. In the streets and homes of Pullman, a sense of solemn determination took hold. They were fighting not only for themselves but for future generations of workers who might one day demand fairness, justice, and respect. Keynote 9 captures this moment of intense national attention, heightened conflict, and moral tension. It is a chapter in which the rebellion ceases to be a local labor dispute and becomes a historic event, tested on multiple fronts: military, political, social, and moral. The workers' courage, the families' endurance, and the nation's reaction all intersected in a complex, dangerous, and transformative struggle. By the end of this stage, it was clear that the Pullman strike had achieved more than temporary disruption. It had exposed the tensions inherent in a rapidly industrializing America, and had demonstrated the potential power of organized labor to challenge both corporate authority and governmental force. The story of Keynote 9 is a reminder that history is not only written by victories, but also by courage, sacrifice, and the willingness of ordinary people to face overwhelming odds. Chicago in 1894 became the crucible in which these lessons were forged, and the events of this period would resonate for decades, influencing labor relations, governmental policy, and the understanding of collective action. The Pullman strike and the pivotal moments captured in this keynote exemplify the human capacity for resilience, determination, and the pursuit of justice, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable opposition. As the Pullman strike reached its conclusion, the consequences of months of conflict became undeniable. Keynote 10 examines the aftermath, the long-term repercussions, and the lessons drawn from a struggle that had consumed a city, challenged a nation, and tested the endurance of every individual involved. The strike had started as a labor dispute over wages and rents, but by the end, it had become a defining moment in American history, a confrontation that revealed the fragility of social order, the limitations of governmental power, and the resilience of human spirit in the face of oppression. The immediate aftermath in Chicago was one of devastation and quiet despair. Streets bore the scars of battle, rail cars overturned, factories closed, windows shattered, and buildings blackened by fire. Families who had endured months of fear and deprivation now faced the practical task of rebuilding their lives. Fathers returned home bruised and exhausted. Mothers assessed the losses to their homes and meager savings, and children tried to reconcile the chaos they had witnessed with the normalcy they longed for. Yet even as the physical scars healed, the psychological wounds lingered. The events of the strike had left an indelible mark on everyone involved, a memory of fear, courage, and defiance that would not be easily erased. Workers who had participated in the strike faced further challenges. Many were blacklisted, unable to find employment in industries controlled by Pullman or allied corporations. Arrests and convictions for so-called rioting or obstruction created lasting hardships. Families struggled to survive on diminished incomes, while the broader labor movement grappled with the chilling effect of federal intervention. Yet these hardships also forged a profound understanding of solidarity and resilience. Workers realized that while the immediate battle might have been lost or constrained, the principles they had fought for, fair treatment, livable wages, and dignity, could not be erased from the collective consciousness. The lessons learned in these months would guide future labor movements, informing strategies, organizing tactics, and the understanding of collective power. In the political sphere, the strike exposed deep divides within the nation. President Grover Cleveland's decision to send federal troops had been heavily criticized by some and praised by others. While it restored order in the short term, it also fueled debate about the appropriate balance between governmental authority, corporate interest, and individual rights. The public had witnessed firsthand how force could be used to suppress dissent, but they had also seen workers assert their rights in the face of overwhelming power. These conflicting narratives shaped public discourse for years, contributing to the rise of labor advocacy, unionization efforts, and legislative reforms aimed at protecting workers from arbitrary oppression. One of the most enduring aspects of Keynote 10 is the moral ambiguity it reveals. The strike demonstrated both the capacity for extraordinary courage and the potential for extreme violence when human desperation collides with authority. Soldiers acted with brutal efficiency, yet they were executing orders under a belief that they were maintaining national stability. Workers resisted with righteous anger, yet their actions sometimes escalated conflict and caused destruction. The line between right and wrong, heroism and criminality, became blurred. Observers were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that in such struggles, morality is not simple, and the consequences of choices, by workers, leaders, or government, are rarely contained. Debs, the leader of the American Railway Union, emerged from the strike as a symbol of unwavering commitment to principle, though at great personal cost. He was arrested, tried, and imprisoned, yet his reputation as a labor leader grew. The strike had demonstrated both the potential power of organized labor and the lengths to which corporate and governmental entities would go to suppress it. Debs's experience highlighted the risks inherent in standing up to systemic authority, but also illuminated the enduring influence of moral leadership in shaping public perception and inspiring future generations. His incarceration became a rallying point, a reminder that even in defeat, ideas and courage can resonate far beyond the immediate moment. Economically, the strike had wide-ranging effects. Railroads were temporarily immobilized, disrupting commerce across multiple states. Businesses dependent on timely shipments experienced losses, and the national economy felt the tremors. While the federal intervention restored operational order, it did not resolve the underlying tensions that had sparked the strike. Wages, rents, and labor conditions remained points of contention, signaling that the conflict between capital and labor was far from settled. The strike had illuminated systemic weaknesses, highlighting the need for negotiation, legal frameworks, and structured mechanisms for resolving labor disputes, a lesson that would eventually contribute to the establishment of labor rights protections in the United States. The cultural and historical legacy of the Pullman Strike was profound. It became a symbol of worker solidarity, a cautionary tale of governmental intervention, and a narrative that resonated in literature, newspapers, and public memory. Stories of heroism, sacrifice, and resilience were passed down, shaping perceptions of labor struggles and influencing public consciousness about the rights and dignity of working people. The strike also demonstrated the importance of documentation, eyewitness accounts, and media in framing historical events. While newspapers had initially portrayed workers as villains, the broader historical record preserved the truth of their courage, their suffering, and their endurance. Families who had endured the strike carried forward memories that shaped their communities. Lessons about resourcefulness, mutual support, and perseverance became embedded in family lore, influencing generations. Children who had witnessed the turmoil grew into adults who understood both the fragility of social order and the importance of standing up for fairness. Women, who had navigated the homefront struggles, emerged as quiet yet powerful symbols of resilience, often transmitting values of courage, solidarity, and moral responsibility to the next generation. Ultimately, Keynote 10 captures the culmination of the Pullman Rebellion not as a simple victory or defeat, but as a complex, multidimensional event that shaped the course of labor history, social consciousness, and civic engagement. The strike revealed the human cost of industrial conflict, the power of organized labor, and the consequences of governmental and corporate action. It demonstrated that while immediate outcomes may favor authority, the lessons learned, the courage displayed, and the moral truths revealed endure far longer. The Pullman Strike left behind a legacy of struggle, sacrifice, and resilience, a testament to the enduring capacity of ordinary people to challenge extraordinary power, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The Pullman Strike remains one of the most defining moments in American labor history, a story of courage, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It was a conflict that tested the limits of human endurance, the resolve of ordinary workers, and the power of collective action against industrial and governmental authority. Families endured hunger and fear, streets became battlefields, and yet, amid chaos and oppression, the spirit of unity and determination shone brighter than any threat. This rebellion proved that true change is never handed freely. It is demanded, fought for, and sometimes paid for in blood, sweat, and unyielding resolve. The lessons of Pullman resonate today, reminding us that standing up for fairness, dignity, and human rights transcends time. It is a story of resilience that continues to inspire generations, a testament to the power of ordinary people to challenge extraordinary forces, and a vivid reminder that history is shaped not only by the powerful but by those brave enough to rise against them.